Looking at the current gas prices in and around Montreal, seeing pretty much about $1.75 a liter. And I've been hearing from people saying, Elias, the weekly fill up, it's hurting them in the wallet. So you may be looking to change your set of wheels, but you're also probably looking for a deal. And if you're looking for a used car and thinking about, well, what kind of car should I buy, especially keeping in mind the price of gas? Well, our next guest took a deep dive into the used car market and found that used electric vehicles are the best bang for your buck. Researchers at the University of Michigan looked at everything from purchase price, depreciation, fuel, maintenance, insurance, and they found that in many cases, a used electric vehicle can save drivers thousands of dollars over its lifetime. Let's go to Dr. Maxwell Woody, a research associate for the Center of Sustainable Systems at the University of Michigan. Dr. Woody, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
175 Canadian a liter is about $4.80 US a gallon, FYI. So let's talk about the value that you're seeing in your research with used EVs.
Yes. So when we did this study, this was before these recent spikes in gas prices. So it's important to keep in mind that we found that a used electric vehicle was generally cheaper than a used gasoline vehicle even before this recent increase. This was in our study a few years ago. The gas prices were in the $3 to $4 per gallon, not this $4+ per gallon situation that we find ourselves in now. So I think the savings has only increased in the last few months.
And that is interesting. So before you get to these, more recently inflated prices, what made the EV, the used EV, a good deal or a good decision?
Right. So there's a few places where the electric vehicle has advantages. The first is in the fuel cost. So electricity is generally less expensive than gasoline for refueling the vehicle. It also generally has lower maintenance and repair costs than a gas vehicle because it has fewer moving parts. The downside is that consumers do generally pay a higher price up front for that vehicle, but in the used vehicle market, that makes a much less of a difference. So because electric vehicles depreciate a little bit more than traditional gas vehicles in those first couple of years, if you buy it as a second owner of that vehicle, there's a big savings there. You might pay a similar price or even a cheaper price than a similarly aged gas vehicle. And then from that point, all those savings on fuel, on maintenance, and repairs all work to your benefit.
Does it matter what type of EV we're talking about? I know there's lots of options in the market. Does it matter what type of EV?
So the biggest savings is available for smaller vehicles, so sedans rather than your pickup trucks, and for vehicles with a smaller range, since the battery is such a big component of the electric vehicle cost. For the really high-range vehicles, the up to 400 miles or so, that's where there might no longer be much of a savings. But in that 200 to 300-mile range, your more low-end or standard EV ranges, there's still a pretty good savings there.
I was reading Car and Driver. I referenced this a few minutes ago on the program. It was on the Car and Driver website. They said 2026 will be a great time to buy a used EV. They referenced a flood of off-lease EVs. So these are purchases from 3 or 4 years ago when EVs started to take off that are now coming to market as those leases end. Is that one of the reasons why, supply demand here? Let's talk about the supply. Is that one of the reasons we're seeing that those decent prices?
Yeah, that's one of the exact scenarios we looked at in our study. We compared new electric vehicles and new gas vehicles versus vehicles that were 3 years old, which is a common time frame for like a 36-month lease to have ended. So when we get all those used vehicles 3 years old, they still have most of their life left ahead of them. They haven't actually depreciated in quality very much, but there's been a good amount of depreciation in the dollar value that you're going to get for that car. So that's where there's an opportunity for consumers to buy that slightly used 3 to 4 year old vehicle, not pay nearly as much as they would for the new vehicle, and still have a long lifetime of that vehicle left in front of them.
Now, you're preaching to the converted here because I have an electric vehicle. This is my second one. I absolutely adore it. I'm never going back to gas. That thing is very certain in my life. But I hear from people that they look at an EV and they worry about problems. They worry about the battery. You mentioned how that's the most expensive component in these vehicles. They're worried about, well, they'll buy a used vehicle and then the battery will go kaput. What can you say on that end? What do we know? What does the research show on, you mentioned maintenance, but, major failures and that kind of stuff and dealing with that if you buy a used EV?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest concern that we've heard from people considering used EVs is what about the battery? And right now we see that batteries tend to degrade maybe 1.5 to 2.5% of their capacity per year. I know in the U.S., batteries have a 100,000-mile warranty. So in most EVs, what we're seeing is that the battery will last at least as long as the vehicle's lifetime, if not longer. That's not all EVs, that's not all the time, but in most cases, the battery lifetime does not seem to be a limiting factor for the vehicle's lifetime.
And that's it, right? Like most manufacturers, 8 years or 10 years, and also the kilometer limit there on the battery warranty. And if you're buying a used vehicle that's only 3 years old, you're still getting much of that remaining warranty.
Exactly, and the warranty is transferable too. That's important to note with the batteries, that the warranty comes with it for the second owner.
Can we talk dollars here? What kind of savings are we actually talking about?
Yeah, so it depends on how long you own the vehicle, of course. If we look at maybe like a 7-year ownership period, you buy it when it's 3 years old, own it for 7 years, and then resell it back to a dealership or to someone else at year 10. Then we're talking maybe in the range of $5,000 to $10,000 of savings over that time period compared to a comparable gas vehicle. But it's important to note here that this is really dependent on your location as well. So part of our study was looking at different cities. It was 17 cities that we looked at, all in the U.S., but I think the same concepts apply here, is that places have much higher gas prices than some other places. Some cities have much higher electricity prices than other locations. Mm-hmm. The cost of insurance can vary quite a bit based on where you are. So all these factors come into play when you're considering how much you as an individual might save.
Well, Quebec's a great example of that, friend, because, we have high gas prices, and then we've got the lowest consumer rates for electricity in North America. It's like it depends on the rate, but 6 or 7 Canadian cents per kilowatt hour. And that's, there's a bigger disparity in our market here than you'd find in a lot of other places.
That would be a great opportunity then.
How should someone make that decision? What should our listeners, to wrap up here, what should our listeners be looking for? What should they be looking at if they're scouring the used market right now to get that deal?
Yeah, so generally you'd want to look for a used vehicle, kind of that sweet spot of 3 to 6 years old, I think, is probably best. You want to make sure that the battery is still under warranty. And then you also want to consider your own personal situation. So one of the things that allows an electric vehicle owner to capture some of that savings is the ability to charge at home rather than relying on public charging, which is generally a lot more expensive than your home charging prices. So if you're in a situation where you have the ability to install a home charger or have access to home charging, it's much more feasible than if you're in a situation where you're renting your residence or you're in an apartment building. In those locations, you're not going to see as much savings just because you're not going to have the ability to charge at home as much.
Yeah, and in Montreal, we've got a very good level 2 charging network. We stand alone in North America for that. But, level 3 charging, the supercharging, the fast charging, boy, it can really get expensive if you rely on that. Dr. Woody, listen, we got to leave it there. I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's Dr. Maxwell Woody, a research associate at the University of Michigan.
Unmistakably Canadian.
It's the music that raised you.
The artists raising the bar.
Hi, this is Brian Adams.
Hey, my name's Brett Emmons. I'm from the Glorious Sons.
Hi, I'm Nelly Furtado.
Made in Canada. The station that champions Canadian music.
Loud, proud, and all yours.
No passports required. Just press play.
Tap into Made in Canada now on iHeartRadio.ca
or the free iHeartRadio app.